This next session, we are going to talk about what the debate round actually looks like. Okay, so the different format for the speeches that you will be giving. This is the format that Shanna and I will follow when we do our demonstration debate. And this is also the format you will follow on Friday when you debate on your own. Okay? So, first, there are two people on any given debate team, okay? So the affirmative will have two speakers, and the negative will have two speakers. They have what is called speaking positions, okay? So there is on the affirmative team, you have a first affirmative speaker. So for the affirmative, whoever gives the first speech for the affirmative side is called the first affirmative, okay? Whoever gives the second speech for the affirmative side is called the second affirmative speaker. We can abbreviate this by just calling them the the 1A and the 2A, okay? It works the same way for the negative. The first speaker for the negative team is the 1N. The second speaker for the negative team is the 2N, right? So, what your debate rounds will look like as follows. The affirmative team always speaks first. So, the first speech is given by the 1A. And it is called the constructive speech, okay? Every speaker has an opportunity for two speeches. A constructive speech, which happens in the first half of the debate round, and then in the second half of the debate round, you get a rebuttal. So, the first affirmative constructive is the first speech in a debate round. Whoever is the first affirmative speaker, their job is to just present the affirmative case. Right? So this consists of three big components. You need to present a plan. You need to present some harms or advantages. And then you need to explain how your plan solves those harms or advantages, okay? So, when you all looked at that evidence packet that Shanna and I put together, you saw when you were on the affirmative side that there was an observation called inherency, where Shanna had the plan. She had an observation about solvency, where she explained how her plan would fix problems. And then after that, she had three possible advantages or harms, things that the plan could solve, right? So the first affirmative speaker presents all of this information. After the first affirmative speaker, the first negative speaker gives their constructive speech. Okay? The first negative speaker has two jobs in this speech. First, they present any off-case arguments. So, this is sometimes a tricky term. An off-case position is any type of argument that the negative can read against the plan that doesn't address the affirmative case directly as it is read in this speech, okay? So, for example, we talked a little earlier today, we talked about that disadvantage with Prime Minister Abe, if you remember, how if the plan were to be passed, Prime Minister Abe would get a surge in popularity and he would be able to move Japan towards collective security. Well, that is a position that has nothing to do with what the affirmative presented at the very beginning. It doesn't address their advantages or their solvency. It is a separate issue. So we call it an off-case position. Does that make sense?
About explaining the difference between plan and solvency?
Yes, okay. The plan is just the statement of, we think the government of Japan should do this. Okay? The solvency is actual evidence that the team should provide that explains how the plan that you've proposed solves the problems. So the plan is something that you and your partner come up with and say, thus we propose that Japan do this. Solvency is actual evidence that explains how that plan would work. Does that make sense?
People who is first negative side talk about the first affirmative person.
Yes, yes. And that is the second job that the negative speaker has. Off-case position. So the first thing the first negative speaker does is present off-case positions. Once they are finished presenting these off-case positions, these disadvantages, then they should do exactly that and talk about the case. They should directly refute. What are ways that the plan doesn't solve? What are ways that the plan makes those advantages that they claim, makes those harms? Are there ways that they make it worse? Are there reasons why those particular harms aren't a big deal, that the affirmative team is exaggerating, making a big deal out of nothing? So directly answering what is presented in the first affirmative constructive speech, those are called on-case arguments. Okay. So the first negative constructive speaker should do both of those things. They should present any off-case positions that the negative team wishes to use in the debate round, and then once they're done with that, directly answer your opponent's case. Okay. You with me so far?
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Could you give me further explanation about off-case?
Sure. So often, say on the affirmative, Shanna explains that we need to ban GMOs in Japan so that Japan can develop that soft power that we talked about earlier, okay? And that is for one advantage. Well, I have this position that says that, if Japan bans GMOs, then the world will stop producing genetically modified wheat, and that's bad. Now, my argument has nothing to do with soft power, right? But it's still a reason why the plan is bad. So that is called an off-case position that I would present, because it is still a reason why the plan might be a bad idea, but not something that directly answers the advantages that she's presented.
Another way of explaining this is that the affirmative in the first speech, that is their case. So everything they say in that first speech is what their case is all about. They're proposing this case, and they have evidence to support it and so forth, but we can refer to it as the case. So any arguments that directly correspond or relate to the first affirmative speech, those would be case arguments. Any arguments that are new that can still be linked or can still relate to the affirmative but did not exist in that first speech, those would then be called off-case arguments. Does that help?
Thanks, Dr. Z. Okay. So, after this, the affirmative speaks again. So this is the opportunity for the second affirmative speaker to present. So they give the second affirmative, constructive, or the 2AC. Okay? The job of the second affirmative speaker in this constructive speech is to answer. Okay? Whoever is the second affirmative speaker needs to answer all the arguments that the first negative speaker brought up. Okay? Now, the most important thing to an affirmative debater at all times is your case. That is how you win a debate round, is the case that you read in the 1AC, the plan that you're defending. It is the most important thing to you. Now, some second affirmative speakers, because the negative speaker will read their off-case positions first, they want to answer the off-case positions at the very beginning of their speech. Before you move on to the negative positions in the second affirmative speech, you need to answer the case arguments. Before you do anything else, win your case. Defend your case. Okay?
Because remember, as the affirmative, if you cannot win your case, you cannot win the round. So that's why you always want to put it as the first thing you talk about in that second speech. Because let's say you spend all of your time answering the bad reasons of what would happen if planned, answering those off-case arguments Jake's talking about. If you do that and you can't answer your case, they get all of the reasons why the case is bad, and so you have nothing to win, right? So you always want to have the case first. You have to make sure you win it. That way you have something to talk about in later speeches as well.
Okay, sound good? Make sense? Yeah.
So second affirmative speakers have to not only listening to first negative speaker speech, but also understand the content of the first affirmative speech.
Yes, yes, absolutely. This is, this particular speech, there is a lot going on. There's a lot of responsibility here because you have to defend this position and be able to refute the negatives positions. Okay. So a lot of people feel that this is when, at this point in the debate round, this is when the debating, the clash between positions really starts to heat up. Okay, this is when the debate really gets going. It's because there's that interaction. I think that this is where the debate starts to get exciting. This is where debate gets fun. Okay. Any more questions so far? Yeah.
Are there any question time between first affirmative speech and first negative speech, and first negative speech and second affirmative speech?
Yes. After each of these constructive speeches, there is a cross-examination time. Okay? So we'll go ahead and...
There's a yellow marker for,
Oh.
wait, for cross-section you do yellow.
Yeah, I was just going to write 2NC.
It's also in your packet. Under this session, session 5, there's a listing of the speeches and the time. Page 8.
Okay, so after each constructive speech, oh, I forgot one. After each one of these constructive speeches, there is a time for cross-examination where, say, I'm the affirmative speaker. Well, after my constructive speech, a negative speaker then has the opportunity to ask me questions. Okay? So there is a particular speaker, so after the first affirmative constructive speech, whoever is the second negative speaker asks the questions. Okay? And the reason for that is during that period, the first negative speaker is preparing to deliver their speech. So they have that time to listen and use the information that comes out in cross-examination to help prepare their speech.
It's extra prep time. Because if you see it down at the bottom, it'll say that you get 8 minutes of preparation time. This is an extra for everyone. This is that extra 3 minutes where you can specifically look at what you want to read while your partner is asking questions.
Right.
It's also the time where if you do not understand something, you want to make sure you ask your partner to ask that question for you so you can get it cleared up for you. Does that make sense? So if you didn't understand, be like, I don't know what the plan is doing, if like Jake and I were partners and I was the 1 in, and Jake was the 2, so he was asking the questions, and I didn't know what plan was doing, I would say, hey, Jake, can you ask them to explain the plan for me? And so he would get up and say, can you please explain plan? And I would listen and then start writing my answers down. Does that make sense? So even though you're not the one actually asking, you can have your partner ask for you.
See, this type of cooperation is very important in this type of debate. It's just one of the many ways in which you really need to work with your partner. Because even though only one of you is speaking at once, you are speaking for both representatives of your team. So you need to make sure that you are working together, that you are on the same page, okay? So a good way to remember this then is whoever is not speaking next is the person who asks the questions, okay? The person who is speaking next should be preparing, okay? All right, so. This next part of debate can get a little confusing. It is called the negative block, okay? And it's called the negative block because the negative team, the negative debaters, speak twice in a row. Now, we do this because, as we talked about earlier this morning, the affirmative team has a lot to do, right? They have this burden of proof, which can make things very difficult for the affirmative. So to try and make it a little bit more even, we give the affirmative team the opportunity to speak both first and last in the debate round, as you'll see. So in order to make that possible, that means the negative has to speak twice in a row. So the way this works is that these positions that the negative has brought up, you should split them up between these two positions, okay? Meaning that often the first negative speaker in this speech will take the off-case argument, while in the constructive speech, the negative speaker will take the case arguments, okay? And make new, because they have the opportunity to make new arguments there in the speech. All right? That's one way that you can split the argument. But as Dr. Z likes to say, this speech here is called the first negative rebuttal, not the first negative repeatal. You should not repeat the same things that your partner said in this speech. One of the strategic advantages of being negative is this block right here. So in order to get the most use out of it that you can, split up the positions that you read in the debate so that you have that opportunity to really develop them here. So your job in this part of the debate round is to, okay, so in the second affirmative constructive, the second affirmative speaker is going to make all of these answers to your positions that you read in the first negative constructive speech. So you need to build your positions back up. You need to re-explain why the affirmative's case doesn't solve, or why the affirmative's harms, why their advantages aren't worth trying to solve for. You need to explain why the second affirmative speaker's reasons for the plan are no good. Okay? At the same time, whoever is taking the off-case position that you want to win needs to explain why, yes, this is a terrible thing that the plan will cause to happen, and why that terrible thing is worth avoiding. Why does this disadvantage mean we should not vote affirmative? How is this disadvantage worse than being in the status quo without the plan? Okay, so you need to answer all of these positions that the second affirmative constructive speaker answered your positions with. Does that make sense?
Would you mind repeating about the content of the first negative rebuttal speech?
Yes. Okay. The first negative rebuttalist takes whatever position that were brought up in the first negative constructive that the second negative constructive did not discuss. Okay, so if there is, because in the first negative constructive, we can divide this between an off-case position and then those on-case arguments. Well, if the second negative constructive talks only about those on-case arguments, that leaves this off-case position for the first negative rebuttalist to really emphasize. Okay, so the job of the first negative rebuttalist is to take whatever is left and build up those positions and answer the affirmative responses.
So first negative speakers cannot talk about the first negative and second negative speech?
You should not. You should try and split that up. Because if, say that Shanna and I are partners, and in my second negative speech, I talk all about our off-case position, okay? And that's my second negative constructive. Shanna, in her rebuttal here, also talks all about these same issues. Well, that means that we're just repeating each other. And that means that one of those speeches has just been wasted because we're not making more arguments. Okay?
This will actually probably become more clear once you talk about the next speech.
Right.
Also, real quick, the other thing is if you split up, like Jake and Dr. Z are telling you to, it makes your job as the negative, whichever speaker you are, easier, right? Because no longer, as the second negative, do you have to talk about absolutely everything. You get to choose, I only have to talk about this chunk. This is all I have to focus on in the round, right? This is what you have to understand. So then, all the negative has to make sure, the one is making sure of, is this chunk, right? So you get to split it up that way so you have something that you get to focus on and make sure that you can persuade and convince the judge without, remember, beyond a reasonable doubt, that you should win. So this, it sounds weird to break it up, but it makes the job for you easier and the job for the judge easier because they get to think about things in chunks and really focus on the round as it goes along so that you can convince them to vote for you. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You also have the opportunity through doing what we call splitting the block. In this first negative constructive speech, you're making lots of different kinds of arguments, a variety of arguments, off-case position, lots of different arguments about the case. Here, since you're splitting it up that way in the block, you have the time to really develop those positions, give lots of reasons for the way, for how you are arguing. Okay? Read evidence that supports your original position. And it just makes your positions, your arguments, seem very thorough because you have that opportunity. The other reason that we split the block from the negative perspective is to make things very difficult for the affirmative speaker in the next speech. So, this is when the first affirmative speaker gets to speak again. It's been a while since all the way back here, but now they're back in the game, okay? I think that this is one of the most fun speeches to give in debate. It's a great time. Now, here's the tricky part. Now, we talked about the negative block. Well, the negative got to speak twice in a row, and chances are they split the block and really developed these different positions, right? Well, this speaker has to answer all of it, okay? You need to make arguments about all of these different positions. Okay?
And that's 9 minutes of negative speech time versus 3 minutes of the first affirmative rebuttal.
Right. So you have 3 minutes in this speech to answer 9 minutes of negative. That can be a little scary, but I'll tell you that this speech is so much fun. It is fast-paced, and you just have to know how to make choices. So what I mean when I say make choices is, because you only have 3 minutes, you don't have time to reiterate every single argument that your partner made back in this speech, right? You just don't have time for it. Your partner had 6 minutes, you only have 3, so you can't do that. And also you have all of this to contend with. So you need to look back to this speech and think, what were my partner's best answers? What were the best pieces of evidence that my partner read? And you emphasize those positions. Not everything, but the key arguments that will help you win this debate round. The best positions you have against those negative arguments.
So what you really want to think about is, you'll think about the entire round, look at it, and if there's an argument, and you want to kind of put yourself in the judge's shoes, okay? If I were the judge, would I vote on this argument? Could they lose the round on this argument? If not, it's not important, right? If you can't lose on it, it's a small thing to think about. But if you get to that big argument and you're like, oh, if I was the judge, I could vote here. I could lose the round here. You want to make sure that that's what you focus on. And you really answer that so that you can convince the judge that what the negative said, you don't want to vote for it, you want to vote for the plan. So let's say that I was the affirmative and Jake was negative, okay? And so Jake has just done this. He and his partner have just made some case arguments and a disadvantage, okay? So a bad thing. I get up for the 1AR. I would want to make, so if he says, let's use GMOs. Let's say if on case, so we're looking at the stuff on the plan, that we have to have GMOs so that Japan banning GMOs won't stop it. They'll still get in somehow, okay? Which means my plan can't solve anything. Even if Japan doesn't grow them, they'll sneak in some food that Japan imports from another country, okay? So I can't solve the problem. Well, I could lose on that, right? Because I'm saying, oh no, my plan stops GMOs completely. So I have to make sure I answer that argument, okay? And then he would say, well, we've been talking about the Abe DA. He's saying that, well, if you increase Abe's perception and people like him, he's gonna allow Japan to have an army again, and we're gonna lose ties with China and South Korea, and everyone's gonna get in a war. We're gonna fight. Well, that's pretty bad. I should probably focus on that so I would want to make sure I focus on that. But let's say Jake has this argument that's like, oh, GMOs, they don't really matter. Doesn't get him a lot in the round, right? Like, would you vote as a judge on, oh, they don't really matter? No. So I can kind of just really not look at that argument, but really focus on those big ones. Does that make sense? A lot of words that I said.
So what you will see in a debate round is that throughout these 3 speeches, there will be a lot of different arguments made, okay? A variety of different types of arguments. Starting here, the debate will get smaller and smaller. We will start to focus on fewer issues, but discuss them more in depth, okay? Every debate round is different, and every debate round will involve certain issues and not others. So it all depends on how we start to choose which issues we want to focus on beginning here. And that is something that you can definitely notice in this first affirmative rebuttal. You don't have time to talk about everything, so what are the biggest issues in the debate round? What are the most important issues in the debate round? Okay. I know that's a lot. Do you have any questions so far about the first affirmative rebuttal or any of the speeches we've talked about so far? Okay.
This will make a lot more sense when we do the demonstration debate and you'll actually get to see it happen.
Right.
It won't seem so weird.
So, before we go into the last two speeches in the debate round, there is something I want to emphasize, which is the difference between a constructive speech and a rebuttal, okay? The constructive speeches are called constructive speeches because you get to build arguments. This is the spot where you get to make any new arguments, okay? Often, one of the reasons why we might give the second negative speaker the on-case position is because then he or she can make new arguments about the case, while the first negative rebuttalist can emphasize something that's already been explained.
Think
Okay?
about it as constructing a building.
Right,
This is the only time you get to make something new.
right. In a rebuttal, then, you aren't allowed to make new arguments. Now, you can give detailed explanations, you can read more evidence, but it can't be a new position, okay?
So rebuttal is like reinforce. So it's to make stronger. So it's that you can clear up whatever it is you're arguing, but you're not constructing anything new. It's just reinforcing.
I wanted to stop here to explain this because the second negative constructive speech has that opportunity to make new arguments. So that means that the first affirmative rebuttalist has the opportunity to answer those new arguments. A lot of novice debaters think that they can get away with just bringing up new things in the second negative constructive, and then when the affirmative answers it saying, oh, that's a new argument, you can't do that, we win the round. It doesn't quite work that way. The affirmative speaker has a chance to answer new positions brought up here, but nothing other than that, okay? Okay. So, now we get to the last two speeches in the debate round, all right? The 2&R is the second negative rebuttal is the last speech the negative has. So this is when the last negative speaker is deciding, okay, how am I going to win this debate round? What are the arguments that I can control to make sure that the judge signs the ballot for my team? Okay? So, the speech is actually very similar to the first affirmative rebuttal in that you have to make choices. You don't have time in this speech either for all of the arguments and explanations that you've made in the block. So you have to choose, what are my best positions here? What are the best arguments? What am I really winning in this debate round? And emphasize those. So emphasize the ways that you are winning, and then find ways that you might lose. You have to think about what are some ways that the last affirmative speaker can wiggle out. How can they, even if they are lying, what can they do to win this round? And you have to preempt those. You have to say, hey, even if the affirmative says this, we still win because. Does that make sense? Okay. So, often what this speech will consist of is this idea. Remember when we were talking about how, at the beginning of today, the negative kind of has two ways that they can win a debate round. They can prove that the affirmative doesn't solve or isn't a big enough problem, or they can choose to prove that the affirmative causes something bad to happen. Well, like I said then, the best negative teams do both. So what you should look at doing here is you should begin your speech by talking about this is something bad that the affirmative team causes. So often that is this off-case position, okay? What is something bad that the affirmative team causes by implementing their plan? When you are done talking about that, then you move on to discussing their case, right? It's just like how when we talked about with the affirmative, when you should always begin with discussing your case, you in the negative in this speech should always begin with talking about their position, their main off-case position, their, what we would call the offense and around. Right? Okay, does that make sense? Feeling good? Okay. So, This is the last speech in the round, okay? The second affirmative rebuttal. The best thing that you can do in this speech is just tell a story, okay? You have to, you've seen the negative strategy. They don't have an opportunity to say anything else after you're done speaking. They don't have any more opportunities to speak. So you have to think about the fact that the last thing that the judge is going to hear are your thoughts and your words. So you want to tell the judge the story of your affirmative. Why is your case important? How does your case solve? Why is your case more important than their off-case position? Okay? Do that comparison. Why are the advantages of my plan bigger than the disadvantages to my plan? Okay? So begin with this type of overview. And when you are done there, then you go and you answer the positions made by the second negative rebuttalist. Okay? But the second affirmative speaker, the best thing you can do is begin with this story that explains why you win the debate round and why voting for the affirmative plan is the best.
That's really important because if you look, we talked about the case all the way over here, right? So by the time we get here, it's been a while. So you want to remind them what you talked about, okay? So that they remember, so that when they go to vote for you or against you, they at least remember what you said in the very first 6 minutes of the speech that happened years ago. So you always want to start with that. This is what remembered. This is the amazing thing that case does. It's fantastic. It will solve all of the problems.
Now, what is often missing, and this is something that goes for both of these speeches, okay? What is often missing is that people talk just about how awesome their position is, and they don't do that comparison between the other team's arguments, okay? So let's pretend that I'm affirmative and Shanna is negative. In this speech, Shanna her big argument is that Prime Minister Abe position, that if Prime Minister Abe gets popular from the plan, he will build an army again, and that will cause Japan to lose ties with South Korea and China. Okay? Well, if I stand up here and just say, yes, but solving for Japanese soft power and preventing the pollution of our ecosystems from GMOs, that's awesome. Those are big impacts that we can avoid, big advantages from doing the plan. If that's all a judge has to go with, how is the judge supposed to decide which is worse? Well, would I rather avoid severing ties with South Korea and China, or would I rather save our ecosystems from being polluted and allow Japan to have soft power? The judge will have a very hard time making that decision because without any type of comparison from you. So as debaters in these two speeches, you need to tell your judges or your judge what impact is bigger and why. Why should the judge vote the way that they vote for your team? So think of these two speeches as this. Your job is to write your judge's ballot. Judges' ballots often say, I vote affirmative because. I vote negative because. In your speech, give them that because. Explain why your speeches, your positions matter more than your opponents.
A great way to start these speeches is you should vote negative because, and then give them the 2 or 3 reasons of why they should vote for the negative team, okay? And then that's when you can go into comparing. So that was what you do as the negative. Or the affirmative, you would say, you should vote affirmative because this is more important than, saving the ecosystem is more important than trade ties with South Korea or China. And then you would give reasoning and warrants to explain them. But you want to provide that comparison so that you can do what's called controlling the round, so that you have more control over what happens on that ballot when you're done talking. Because when I'm judging rounds, I always tell the kids, you tell me where to vote, because if you don't, I get to pick, and you're probably not going to like what I picked to vote on, because it's not going to be what you thought was important. So you have to tell me what is the most important and what I need to look at. So if you write my ballot, you make my job as a judge really easy. Tell me what to write down.
Do you have any questions about these last two speeches? Okay. The last aspect of a debate round that you should be aware of is this idea of prep time. Okay? Now, you don't ever have to stand up and just give one of these speeches right off the bat. Okay? You have the opportunity to use this thing called prep time. Now, each team, I think 8 minutes? Okay. You have a total of 8 minutes in the round, and you can use those 8 minutes whenever you like to stop and prepare your speech before you deliver it. Okay? You can't use more than 8 minutes, and you only get 8 minutes for the whole round. You can divide it up however you like, but you only get a total of 8 minutes.
And that's not per person either. That's for your whole team. So you don't want to use, like if you're the negative, you don't want to use all 8 minutes before this speech, because then your partner in this speech, they don't have anything, right? They just have to get up and talk. Whoops. So you want to make sure that you leave time for your partner to be able to use some. For those of you that have done parliamentary debate, this is the nice thing that policy has, because in parly, you don't even get this cross-X time. Once the affirmative's done, you just got to get up and talk and hope that you have enough to say. So you at least have that time to collect all your thoughts before you have to stand up and talk. But don't, make sure you're sharing with your partner.
I will give both the affirmative the side and the negative side a tip on how to use your prep time. Okay? So, for the negative team. Now these speeches are back to back, right? Well, as the first negative rebuttalist, you don't have to answer anything new that happens in your partner's speech. So, while your partner is speaking, you can prepare this speech during that time. That way, here, you don't have to use any of that prep time. Okay? So you have this whole 6-minute speech, plus this 3 minutes of cross-examination to prepare a really awesome 3-minute rebuttal.
Write out all of your thoughts. You don't need to be looking at the judge during this. You can be looking at your paper and just writing. You don't even need to, if Jake and I were partners and Jake was the 2 in and I was the 1, I would not even look at Jake. And I would probably not even hear his words, because I would just not listen and make sure that I was focusing on what I had to talk about.
Right. That's one of the benefits of splitting up the block this way, is that it's kind of dividing responsibilities, right? And you know who is going to take care of what. Now, because of that though, if the second negative speaker in this speech didn't get to something that they think is really, really important, you can take a little bit of prep time right here and tell your partner, hey, I really want you to say this at the beginning of your speech, if there's something that you missed and want your partner to go for. You should try not to do that, but if worst comes to worst, you do that, okay? So that's a tip for the negative. Now, a tip for the affirmative on using prep time is a lot of prep time is often used before this 1AR, this first affirmative rebuttal, because of how much time the negative is speaking here. That's a lot of answers, there's a lot that you have to prepare for, right? So a good trick is there is 3 minutes of cross-examination between the constructive speech and the rebuttal, where your partner is asking questions and you are just sitting in your seat. Use that 3 minutes And your goal, if you are this speaker, is to try and have a responses prepared for this speech in that time. Use that 3 minutes of cross-examination to prepare yourself for the second negative constructive. Does that make sense?